Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome back. Last day of teaching for the week and then we get to go on a field trip, so hang in there. Yes, so as always I will be giving a global overview of the issue before we move on to the more regional perspectives, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our colleagues from FAO on the work that they've been doing in the region and in various countries. So, as you know, I like to ask a lot of questions. And I think it's quite important for us to understand at the outset what a small-scale fishery actually is, what a small-scale fishery actually is. Because you may have an idea of what this is in your particular country, but globally this is obviously a very diverse sector. So, I'm going to show you some pictures. I want you to tell me if you think that this is a small-scale fishery, okay? You don't have to raise your hand, you can just yell out or nod or shake your head, and no one is being graded, so please just participate in this and we'll see what we come up with. So what do we think? Is this a small-scale fisher? Are these people engaging in small-scale fishing? Any thoughts? There's no right or wrong answer, I promise. Okay. Who thinks this is small-scale fishing? Raise your hand. Okay, I saw one half-hearted raising hand. No one wants to participate? Who thinks this is not small-scale fishing? No one wants to commit. Why would this not be considered small-scale? For what reasons? Small-scale fishing. What do we typically associate with it, with this practice? A boat? Do we have to have a boat to be engaging in small-scale fishing? No? Yes? Okay, no one wants to commit. I promise you, you're not being graded. This is supposed to be for discussion. So, this is what we often call fishing by hand or fishing on foot, or gleaning, that's another word for it. And even though I would personally consider this fishing because you are taking resources out of the marine environment or the aquatic environment, in reality, a lot of the time, data on this particular type of fishing is not necessarily included in national statistics. Obviously, that's a problem because you are, not accounting for certain resources being taken out of the environment. You're not accounting for a certain portion of the sector either that are actually fishing. So, yeah, although I would consider this fishing, a lot of the time this data is not included in national statistics. Also, women are disproportionately represented in this gleaning, fishing on foot sector. And so by not collecting the data, you are, again, ignoring a lot of the time the contributions of women to the small-scale fishing sector as well. Okay, let's see if we can get more interaction on these next ones. What do we think? Is this small-scale fishing? Yes, everybody is. Okay, everybody's a lot more confident on this one. And I think that's fair enough because I think this is a very stereotypical presentation of what we would consider small-scale. There's a small boat, it's sort of open, and certainly I would say that's small-scale. This one? What do we think? We can't really see any fishing equipment in there, right? Maybe trading? Yeah. Yeah, great. By a show of hands, how many of you know in your countries whether you have women fishing on boats? How many of you have women fishing from vessels in your countries? Some of you? Yeah. Malaysia, Indonesia? Yeah. Great. Yeah. And how many of you don't? By a show of hands. Yeah? Yeah, so I think that's fair. There are women who fish from boats, but traditionally, this is a very gendered sector, and women are mostly in the pre-harvest sector and the post-harvest sector, and when it comes to harvesting, often they are involved in the fishing on foot, right? This can be because of cultural stigma. We were in Ghana last year. We went to the canoe harbor, and we asked some of the fishers, why are there no women on the boats? Do any women go out fishing? And they said, no, women don't fish. There was also, this idea that women are bad luck sometimes. Yes, so that's an issue in Thailand as well. Again, I had a student in my class this year from Tanzania, and she was saying that they've had to do a lot of work on gender mainstreaming in the small-scale fishery because when they were talking to some of the fishers, they would say to them, no, if I even see a woman on the way down to the fishing boat, I won't go out. It's bad luck, right? So there was some serious gendered stereotypes around fishing there. What about these two? Is this small-scale fishing? This is... Mm-hmm. So, yeah, these are very big fleets, and these, at least, are very big boats. So why do you think this is small-scale still? What are the characteristics that make it small-scale for you? Okay, what if I told you that these boats, a lot of them have engines, and they're about 20 meters long? Would you still consider it small scale? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just really looking for you. Okay, why? Okay, so you're looking at distance from shore. Okay, interesting. Any other thoughts on this as to why this would or would not be small scale? This fleet catches about 70% of the resources in Ghana. I think we can have a debate, right? It's starting to blur the lines a little bit between small scale and commercial here. But they still consider it small scale for various different reasons, as we'll discuss in a minute. What about this? Still small scale? Yeah? The boats are still small, but now they're decked. You still think it's small scale? Why? Okay. Yep, very good, very good. So you're looking at it from a sort of multi-pronged approach, right? Yeah, great. Okay, so, and the next issue when it comes to, when we're trying to figure out what's small scale and what's commercial is what we actually call these fisheries, right? So probably in your countries you have different names for these fisheries because globally there are different names for these fisheries. Artisanal, I've heard that quite a lot. Is this what you call the small-scale fishers in your countries? Artisanal mostly? Yeah, artisanal. And what does that mean to you, artisanal? Is that just covering the entire sector? Is that just a part of the sector? Do you differentiate between, for example, subsistence and artisanal? Okay, so yeah, so you might have different names. Um, we do also have this label of subsistence. This can also mean different things in different contexts. So subsistence often just means that you are going out and fishing just, you know, for food for yourself and your family. But, you know, for example, in my country, in South Africa, we actually, before we changed the name to small scale, subsistence meant something more than that. Subsistence meant that you could also trade, do small trades as well. So again, you know, these terms are not set in stone. They can mean different things in different places. Sometimes these fishes are also called traditional fishes, sometimes indigenous fishes, and then they may have additional rights under various indigenous peoples' conventions and so on. Sometimes we just say small scale, but ultimately there's no real fixed definition if we're looking at it globally. In your country, you probably do have a fixed definition or a set of characteristics that you look at, but globally it's a lot more diverse. So instead of, as our friend alluded to, instead of necessarily defining small-scale fishers by a certain name or a boat length or whatever it might be, more and more we're starting to look at the characteristics of the sector in order to come up with some sort of definition. So you mentioned some of them, this idea of, how far out do we go? How mechanized are we? How motorized are we? Those kind of things. And so some of the other characteristics we see typically in the sector, I mean, there's an exception to every rule, but again, we are looking at this as a sort of composite whole, trying to understand what's small scale and what's commercial, particularly as things become more mechanized and more motorized. We can look at some of these characteristics to determine what we consider small scale. So, for example, as you mentioned, small scale have typically targeted nearshore resources just because they might lack the ability to go out further. And also mixed fisheries, so it's not so common that they will target, for example, one particular fishery. Sometimes it happens, but often it's a mixture of fisheries, a mixture of gears. They may have traditional fishing grounds, they've been fishing for generations, could be community-based, could also be migratory, following the fish. Do any of you know if you have migratory small-scale fishes in your countries? Those that might follow the fish from country to country. I think there are some examples in this region. Not sure? Okay, we can maybe pick up on that later in the regional discussion. Often they, are very big fleets, landing all over the place, wherever they want, not necessarily at the nice fishing harbor you've constructed, but on landing beaches or, whatever's close to home. Obviously, this makes it very difficult to get the data that you need to understand and manage the sector. Often the resources targeted because they're not sort of export resources, maybe low value, and therefore not subject to the same sort of assessment and management as your big valuable stocks like your tuna. Again, there's often very little tracking of activities because it's just quite difficult when you have very big fleets and very small boats to put AIS trackers or whatever it might be on them. As I've mentioned, roles are often divided by gender, with men at least being the primary ones fishing from boats, whereas women are often fishing, not fishing, but in the pre- and post-harvest sector. And also a practice we see a lot is diversification of livelihoods, where this is available, so not just fishing also being involved in other industries as well, farming, whatever is available. So this is really a way to spread risk, right? So fishing obviously is an inherently risky profession from many perspectives. So this diversification can help to spread risk for these fishes and insulate them from shocks. Now, our FAO colleagues can talk a lot more about this, but given these difficulties and the increasing motorization of small-scale fisheries, increasing mechanization of the sector, the FAO has created this characterization matrix as a way to help countries to differentiate between their small-scale and their large-scale fisheries or commercial fisheries by looking at various elements. So what type of fishing gear is being used, the degree of mechanization, size of the vessel, motorization, where you're fishing, how long you're fishing for, these kind of aspects. And this allows countries to better be able to differentiate between their small scale and their commercial as a way to, understand how to manage and regulate the sector. However, one of the issues that we have when it comes to small-scale fisheries is that we often lack data on this sector. Possibly this is something for those of you who work for fisheries departments are dealing with, reporting data and so on. And this is largely because the sector is informal, so contributions to employment, poverty alleviation, livelihoods, and nutrition are often hidden and underestimated. So apart from the not necessarily having the stock assessment data, because the low-value stocks aren't as interesting to countries, so there's often poor management of those. We also tend to lack social data on the sector as well, which again makes it quite difficult to manage a sector where the social, the environmental, and the economic are so inextricably intertwined. And this is obviously because this sector is a huge contribution to food security, livelihoods, and it's a very immediate concern for these fishers if fish stocks are depleting and so on. And as I mentioned, I haven't mentioned this yet, I have mentioned the gendered nature of the sector, but in general, data on women in the sector is particularly low, often because countries don't separate the data on small-scale fisheries by genders. So there isn't what we call gender disaggregated data, which obviously makes it challenging to understand what contributions women are making to the sector versus what contributions men are making to the sector. However, again, this is another FAO report. They are doing good work on small-scale fisheries. In 2023, there was an attempt to provide a more comprehensive global overview of small-scale fisheries to understand the contributions of small-scale fisheries globally. Again, this report is the first really attempt to do this on a global perspective. But again, you have to rely on the data that the countries have. So from that perspective, there's still obviously data gaps in this report. For example, for inland fisheries, there's really very little data collected. The point that our friend from the Mekong River Commission made the other day, right, that these types of fisheries are just not seen as so important, and obviously despite the fact that they are contributing huge amounts in terms of the catch. As I mentioned, there's also a lack of systematic collection of catch data in small-scale fisheries, which hinders the management of those fisheries. And then finally, one issue I wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that when it comes to managing small-scale fisheries, there isn't a lot of collaboration between different government departments. And so what they also found in this report is that, you know, there's information in things like statistics bureaus and health bureaus and so on small-scale fisheries, which the fisheries department is just doesn't have access to, even though, you know, that would be very helpful for what they're trying to do in the small-scale sector. So very important to talk to each other. And then this is just an example of the fact that gender disaggregated data is very much lacking in this sector. This is a study done in 5 countries, Vietnam is one of them, where there was, apart from Peru, there was limitations or severely limited gender disaggregated data. Although I believe the Philippines is pretty good on collecting this type of data and disaggregating it. However, these are some of the findings that were made by this report, and they are quite illuminating. So, for example, while small-scale fisheries account for at least 40% of global fisheries catch, which I mean is already a very large amount, but you know, isn't the majority, they in fact account for 90% of people employed along the capture fisheries value chain. So you can see there the massive contribution that these fisheries are making to employment, right? Also, the finding that 4 out of 10 women engage in 4 out of 10 people engage in small-scale fisheries of women is very illuminating as well. Particularly if you're not, you know, collecting data on this sector or not disaggregating it, you are missing essentially half of what's happening in the sector. There's 500 million people globally who depend at least partially on small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods. So, of course, 500 million people is not a small amount. And then co-management is implemented for about 20% of the catch in small-scale fisheries globally. So there is a growing movement towards co-management, which our colleagues at FAO will talk about. In Asia here, we can see the global fisheries catch, almost half is being contributed by small-scale fisheries, so obviously this is a huge issue for this region as well. Okay, so now I hope that gives you a kind of global overview of what's going on in small-scale fisheries, but now I want to change tack a little bit and talk about social issues in this sector. Now, if you remember back on Tuesday when we talked about the tragedy of the commons and how that was used as sort of a justification for imposing these kind of neoliberal policies in fisheries, these privatization of fisheries. As part of this assumption, as part of this idea, there was this notion that, you know, small-scale fisheries were the poorest of the poor, and the only way to lift them out of poverty was to make them economically viable. In other words, to turn them into a type of commercial or industrial fishery. And now, you know, for the purposes of this presentation, I want to interrogate that assumption at the heart of that and ask, you know, from your experiences in your countries, do you think that small-scale fisheries are sort of the poorest of the poor in society? Compared to the rest of society, do you believe that your small-scale fisheries are particularly worse off than the rest of society? And I'd like to hear some examples or some thoughts on this. Again, no right or wrong answers, so if you have any thoughts on this, just shout out or raise your hand, whatever you prefer. Anyone want to comment on this question? What do you think? Yeah, I don't know your fisheries, so you tell me. What is happening in your small-scale fisheries? Yeah.
Yeah, so regarding to your questions, but from my personal perspective, I would like to say yes. I believe like in like basis on my knowledge that I believe like in Thailand the small scale they're mostly like excluded from the support from the government. For the example, like for the commercial fishing vessel, they get a subsidize on the field, but the for small scale fisher government doesn't do that in the same way as a commercial. And I believe that like there is like the lack of the support from the government in terms of the how say that the marketing accessing like they might catch the fish and sell it directly when they're landing in the beach, but we don't. I believe like government doesn't do much how to like how to say that, how to train them to make the value of fish. It's like more than like the market price, or like train them how to then negotiate with the vendor or yeah, something like this. Yeah, and like a small scale fisher in Thailand, it's not mandatory to be registered with the government. Sometimes there is some kind of like the disaster or something that is no evidence that they are the real small scale fishers, so they cannot access to like the reimbursement from the government as well. Like currently, that's why Thailand we are encouraged very much to this group of the fisher to be registered, whether as for the fisher legislation or the small scale fishery legislation, in terms of that in the future if they experience some kind of the distress, then the government can support them, can do some kind of the reimbursement for them. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. So the small-scale fishers are definitely not as well off as the industrial fisheries, and the government needs more support. Thanks so much for sharing. Does anyone else want to share their experience of their small-scale fisheries in their countries, and what you think about this question? Our fisheries departments? Philippines, yeah.
Good morning, Myra from Philippines. So in the Philippines, small-scale fishers are considered poor because they have a low and unstable income. So the fishermen, especially during seasonal closure, there are months that the area is closed because of the spawning season. So sometimes they don't have an alternative livelihood. That's why they are experiencing difficulties in terms of financial. And also, small-scale fishers depend mainly on middlemen. So we have middlemen. So the middleman is the one who will bought the catch from the small-scale fisher. So for example, me as a small-scale fisher, I will sell the fish in a lower price, and then the middleman, he will be the one to sell it to the market. So, but in a higher price. So, in our perspective, it's very somewhat unfair to the part of small-scale fishers. But however, for the part of the small-scale fisher, they cannot really enter into the big market without the middleman. That's why they are considered in our country still poor. That's all. Thank you.
Yep, thanks so much for bringing up those various examples. I think that's really interesting. Any other perspectives? I think we could take one more. Any other countries want to weigh in? Yes, and Timor-Leste.
Yes, I don't work really close with the fishery department, but I think it depends on the income that they have daily, because they all depends on the government support. And so if they, with the equipment that they have, like very simple boat and the various fishing gear, it's difficult to get the fish every day, daily. So that means it will affect also to their income. So they remain poor and difficult to develop. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks so much for all those examples. And I think you've actually preempted my next question, which is if you think that small-scale fisheries are poor, why? And you've given a lot of examples. Yeah, it's interesting. In other regions, actually, they tend to say no, but they are vulnerable. But it essentially amounts to the same thing, that, you know, in general, small-scale fishers are facing poverty and or vulnerability to poverty for the same set of reasons, some of which you have articulated. So there's a lot of sources of vulnerability in small-scale fisheries. We don't necessarily see abject poverty in small-scale fisheries globally, but we do certainly see vulnerability to poverty. These include things like, of course, the dangers of fishing. Obviously, as we know, fishing is the most dangerous profession. And particularly when you're in a small-scale vessel, there's often a lack of safety equipment, communication devices, navigation aids, and so on. So you're much more likely to get lost, have accidents, to potentially be killed. There's often poor labor conditions on board. Another thing that many of you mentioned or was part of this sort of broader category is the fact that the work is informal, which means that you don't always know, you're going out every day, you don't always know if you're going to make an income. And because of that, because you're not in formal employment, if there are systems of protection, of social protection in the country, such as social security or insurance, often fishers are not able to access those. We also often see geographical isolation. Again, I think it's what our colleague from Timor-Leste was mentioning, that there's just potentially a lack of access to things like alternative livelihoods. But there's a lot of fishers living in rural communities, and in those cases, you might also not have access to things like adequate healthcare, education, finance, justice, and so on. There's also often a lack of tenure rights over resources and lands. So small-scale fishers might not necessarily have rights over the fish that they are targeting or the area that they're targeting, and also over the land that they're living on. Now, small-scale fishers, what kind of land are they mostly living on? Where is it? If you're talking about marine small-scale fishers, for sure, where are they living mostly? Yeah, coastal areas, exactly. Yeah, and islands, yeah. And coastal areas are pretty valuable, right? There's a lot of different industries that often want to use those coastal areas. Industries with maybe a lot more power and money than the small-scale fishers. So if some developer wants to come and build a big hotel complex over that land, you know, they have the money, they may end up displacing those fishers, right? If they don't have tenure rights over that land, they have to move somewhere else, further from the resources on which they depend. This was a huge problem in South Africa during apartheid, that coastal communities were constantly being moved away from the sea. There's of course also the issue of climate change and extreme weather events. Again, if you're living near the coast, you know, you're going to be particularly vulnerable to that. Depletion of resources, as we know, is a big issue around the world. These are the resources on which you depend for food and livelihood. That's a problem. And then again, something which our friend from the Philippines alluded to is this idea of marginalization, political and social isolation. This idea that the fishers are not able to sell directly to, you know, the markets. They have to go through a middleman for various reasons. There's also often lower education levels in fishing communities. That also doesn't help when it comes to having a sort of voice in political processes. And also we often see, because fish is valuable, we see this sort of elite capture of resources, fish resources, by those who have a lot more power and money. And so, you know, some of the research which has been done in the last, I would say, 20, 25 years is on this idea of poverty, vulnerability, and marginalization, and how these three things interact. And essentially, there's this idea that if you want to lift fishers out of poverty, or you want to prevent them falling into poverty, then you actually need to be addressing these sources of vulnerability and marginalization first. And if you don't do that, even if you start to put in poverty reduction mechanisms, they may not work, because as soon as you have some sort of shock, like the example of, communities being moved off of their land, for example, then, everything falls apart. The issue of gender equity is also a big source of both marginalization and vulnerability. Because again, if you don't understand what's going on in that sector, if women's work is informal and unpaid or underpaid, again, if you have some shock of, that women can't work for any reason, whatever it might be, everything falls apart because there's no social security available, no insurance, nothing to fall back on. So very important kind of concept that if you want to address poverty, you need to be addressing these sources of vulnerability in small-scale fisheries. Now, of course, as an international lawyer, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the sort of international framework for small-scale fisheries. It's all voluntary at the moment. But Life Below Water, SDG 14, does in SDG 14B have a specific goal of improving access for small-scale fisheries to marine resources and markets. But I'm sure you can agree from everything we've been talking about that the other SDGs, many of the other SDGs, are also relevant to addressing these sources of vulnerability. And then, I know Varun will be talking about the voluntary guidelines on small-scale fisheries, so I won't talk about this too much now. But just to mention, this instrument was adopted by the FAO in 2015, and it's really the only international guidelines on small-scale fisheries, or the only international instrument dealing comprehensively with small-scale fisheries. And a lot of its core thematic areas do, again, address some of these vulnerabilities that we've been talking about, things like tenure security, gender equality, disaster risk, and so on. And then finally, again, I know our colleague from FAO has some very interesting examples of management or co-management in small-scale fisheries, so I'm not going to talk too much about management approaches, but just for your information, these are some of the approaches that have been used in the small-scale sector to manage the sector, because as I mentioned, it's very diverse, often very large, very informal. You can't really manage it very well from the top down. It has to be something which is generally done in collaboration with communities, often through co-management or community management. And within that sort of broader framework, there are various approaches that are used to manage this fishery. Things like, dataless management, which is really just a kind of traditional management of inputs into the fishery, close seasons, net sizes, etc., can be helpful when you lack comprehensive data on the particular stocks that are being targeted. I know many of you use inshore exclusion zones in your countries. There's been recent evidence showing that these can be very helpful for improving both environmental and social outcomes, improving income for small-scale fisheries in cases where they are well enforced. And you can actually prevent commercial vessels from coming in. Of course, it's also important to recognize and provide for livelihood diversification where this doesn't exist. As we know, in some places this doesn't actually exist, so it's important in some ways to work with fishers to perhaps scale up things that they're already doing to provide maybe another source of income to diversify risk. And then finally, one interesting thing that's been used or trialed in fisheries and other sort of resource management areas is this idea of using social protection payments as a way to incentivize compliance. So, for example, you know, if you have some sort of insurance scheme and you say health insurance, pensions, whatever it might be, you say, okay, we'll make the payment as long as you come and report to us your fish catch, for example. So that is something that has been trialed. I think it's interesting. It has seen some positive outcomes from both an environmental and social perspective, but, you know, I think, again, this is something that has to be quite carefully managed if, you know, you want to avoid bad actors taking it over, or corruption, or whatever it might be. So, with that, I'm going to close up. I hope that gave you a good overview, or global overview, of the small-scale sector, introduce you to some of these basic concepts as a precursor to you know, the discussions on regional management of the small-scale sector. So thank you so much for your attention and also your participation.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Now we're going to welcome Angela Lendisco.